Hi, everyone, and welcome to @Katie Couric. For more than 2 weeks now, we've been following the remarkable developments out of Egypt, an uprising that began on the so-called Day of Wrath, January 25th, and continues still today in Liberation Square and beyond. So what does this all mean for the future of Egypt, for the region, and for the world? We've assembled a panel of experts. Here in the studio with me is blogger and columnist Mona Eltahawy. In Washington, Stephen Cook is the Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And in Cairo, we're pleased to have CBS News correspondent Elizabeth Palmer, who's been delivering exceptional reporting on this story from the very beginning. So welcome to everybody. And Liz, let me start with you. I know the crowds in Tahrir or Liberation Square continue to grow, and you wrote in a recent blog post, Liz, each day I think they just can't keep it up, and yet somehow they do. So what is the mood on day 16 of this uprising?
Well, a little less festive than yesterday. For some reason, yesterday everything gelled, and it was just like a party down there. The square was as full as I've ever seen it. Everybody was there, infants, old people, mums, families. Today, the protesters have allowed the crowds to diminish a little bit. They're bracing themselves for Friday, when they're going to have another great mass flowing in from the mosques. But what I can tell you is they've kicked it up a little bit. They realize that tactically they need to do something else to keep the pressure on. So just behind me on a side street that runs in front of the Parliament, they've flooded in there now, and they have blocked it off. The same scene, tarpaulins, people sleeping, and the Parliament absolutely blockaded. The soldiers who are inside the gates can't get out. They're guarding an empty building, and of course nobody, including the members of Parliament, can get in.
Give us a sense, Liz, of what's going on in Cairo outside Tahrir Square. Is business starting to become more usual? I mean, are people going to work? Are they going to the banks? Is life returning to some semblance of normalcy?
Economic life is. The banks are open. The central bank did a very good job of distributing cash under the cover of darkness one night. They filled up the ATMs. All the private banks cooperated, and so that very important stream of cash to feed the economy is flowing. The shops are open, but the buzz is this and nothing else. I mean, everybody knows this is going on, and people were really inspired by seeing the young Google activist, Wael Ghonim, on television, humbly saying that he was only one of the activists involved in this, but the real heroes were the young people who died. And somehow that tone of humility and bravery galvanized everybody. It is the only story in town, and millions of people who haven't been down are probably planning to come on Friday. So there's no sense that the momentum is being lost.
And Mona, this uprising was born out of an event that happened on April 6, 2008, or began on that date. Tell me what happened then and how that contributed to what we're seeing today.
What happened on April 6th of 2008 was that workers in the northern town of Mahalla al-Kubra in Egypt had called for a national strike, and this kind of was the penultimate strike after many strikes across the country, unprecedented strikes, because it's illegal to go on strike in Egypt. And so a group of young activists decided to join them and support them, and in solidarity launched a Facebook group called the April 6th Youth Movement. And they called on Egyptians across the country to also go on strike, to show solidarity with these workers. And ever since then, we've seen those young people, the April 6th Youth Movement, become sort of an alternative virtual political party for Egypt's young, disaffected men and women who don't feel the regime represents them, obviously, and also don't feel the opposition represents them. And the April 6th Youth Movement, along with Wael Ghonim, who Liz just mentioned, were the two basically youthful dissident movements that launched the uprising online by calling for people to go out en masse on January the 25th to protest the Mubarak regime, to protest police brutality, and to protest against poverty and unemployment.
Would this have happened without the internet?
I don't think so. I mean, unrest in Egypt has been building up for a long time. There's a lot of anger and resentment towards the Mubarak regime. But I think what the internet did, and I know that the internet did not invent courage. There have been activists in Egypt, human rights activists and street activists for years who have been protesting the Mubarak regime. What I think the internet did was that it created a generation that started to say, I count, because social media gave them an outlet to express themselves that had not existed for these disaffected young people. So I call them Generation Facebook, in that they went online, started expressing themselves, saw that there were many like them around them, organized online, and then took it out into the real world. Once they took it out into the real world, other Egyptians were galvanized by that courage and that ability to organize, and it became not just an online social media movement, but a media for the whole country, I mean a movement for the whole country to join.
And Stephen, maybe you can answer this question, because when I was in Cairo last week, and you hear from pro-Mubarak people, oh, the vast majority of the country supports the president. One of his colleagues told me 90% of Egypt is actually behind Hosni Mubarak. And then, of course, we see all the protesters in Tahrir Square. Do you have any way of knowing what really is popular opinion in Egypt and how much support Mubarak does enjoy?
Well, there really is no way of knowing for sure, given the fact that this kind of open polling, public opinion polling, has not been allowed in Egypt in any kind of systematic way. But you can tell just from the kind of anecdotal evidence that we've seen over the course of the last 16 days. I was in Tahrir Square on the night of January 25th when it was a relatively small crowd of 20 to 30,000, mostly young people. But steadily, we've seen an explosion of people, the hundreds of thousands, millions of people across Egypt. I do know in my conversations while I was still there with people who weren't participating in the protests that they supported the protests, but that they were afraid. They were afraid of police brutality. Well, starting on Wednesday the 26th and Thursday the 27th, and certainly by Friday the 28th, that fear factor melted away, and more people have come out. And as Liz said in Cairo, and as Mona has been watching as well, people are really galvanized. There has been a lot of anger towards the Mubarak regime, particularly over the course of the last 10 years. And the country's essentially been in open revolt since 2004, when you started seeing protest in the industrial heartland and other movements popping up. The April 6th youth movement is an inspired movement, but it's not the first. This social protest has been part of the Egyptian political landscape for some time.
If Mubarak does have supporters, who are they? Is it the moneyed class? Is it sort of the business community? I know that with that terrible day when all those pro-Mubarak protesters rode in on camels and horses, I think a member of parliament said on Al Jazeera that a businessman had actually provided money close to the regime, had paid for many of these people to go to Tahrir Square and wreak havoc. But who are the people who are kind of diehard Mubarak supporters?
Well, over the course of his 30 years, he built a constituency for autocracy that was comprised of the military, the internal security services, the NDP, the ruling National Democratic Party, which was neither national nor democratic nor much of a party. It was essentially a patronage network. Big business and regime-affiliated intellectuals. And over the last couple of years, big business, a lot of corrupt business, had become part of the power structure. And these people essentially form the core of this constituency for autocracy. The pillar of this all, of course, though, is the Egyptian Armed Forces, which has remained steadfastly in support of President Mubarak. But more than just President Mubarak himself, the political system itself, this authoritarian political system, which could go on and survive without Mubarak just under another leader, perhaps Vice President Omar Suleiman, the former director of the General Intelligence Service.
But is the military, and then I'm going to talk to Liz about journalists and how they're being treated right now, but is the military for or against Mubarak? At first they seem to be standing aside while these protests went on. Then they turned, and we saw some pretty nasty things unfolding in Tahrir Square under dark of night, with tasers and artillery fire and all sorts of violence and people getting run over and ambulances, etc. Where does the military stand? Are they solidly behind Mubarak? Or are they potentially, might they move to the other side?
Well, Katie, you have to understand that the military is the inheritors of the people who founded this regime, the free officers from 1952, and they're deeply intertwined in the political system. There is an institutional linkage between the armed forces and the president. And the people around the president, the military officers around the president, owe their positions to President Mubarak.
And of course, he was a general, in
an Air Force commander, an Air Force commander himself.
Yeah.
Exactly. And not only are they politically intertwined with the regime, but economically. The military controls an enormous economic empire, whether it's bottling spring water to building kitchen appliances, agribusiness, resorts, aviation services, security services, and so on. They have a vested interest in the continuation of this regime. But they have played somewhat of a double game here. They've never wanted to come out into the streets and do the dirty work of keeping the streets quiet. But their alleged neutrality suggests actual complicity. On that big day, on that awful day when Mubarak sent the thugs in to beat people who, after all, were only asking to live in a more free and democratic society, the military that morning issued a warning that people should leave Tahrir Square. And when these thugs arrived, they stood aside and essentially enabled this to happen. There were no orders given to the military in Tahrir Square, and that was on purpose so that they didn't do anything.
Liz, let's talk about journalists, because as we witnessed last week, and it's only accelerated, the abuse of journalists seems to be pretty rampant now. What's the situation currently? And have they sort of stepped back on, I mean, who they are? I guess those are pro-Mubarak supporters, but is that still going on with such intensity?
In the last 48 hours, I think the main danger to journalists will be being out of the city in areas where people are only getting the state line on what's going on. The state's been pumping out a lot of propaganda that foreign journalists and agents of foreign powers are causing all this to destabilize Egypt. And so people have been turning on journalists as citizens, blaming them for their economic hardship and blaming them for the worry and the instability. The state security doesn't know where they're coming or going, I think. There's a whiff of panic about almost everything they do, and how to control journalists is the latest example. 2 days ago, they said, right, that's it, you're all going to have to get press cards, here are some forms, and they were organized enough to slide the forms under the hotel doors of where they thought all the journalists were staying, and so we went and filled them out and gave them photographs and whatnot, and then the whole thing's collapsed. Now we can't get the cards back. Nobody seems to know what the fate of the cards are. And meanwhile, the army, who were trying to tell us you can't come into the square without the cards, are now they've thrown their arms up and gone, oh, whatever, you know. So I would say it's less dangerous now from state security and sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't think they know what to do with us.
Well, what about just your average person out on the street? Do you feel threatened when you walk in Tahrir Square, or does it depend on the day and the number of pro-Mubarak supporters who are on hand?
You know, we haven't seen them really since the night the mobs were here. I mean, tiny little incidents here and there, but by and large, Tahrir Square is the safest place in Cairo. I mean, it's a love-in down there. People will tell you they don't like America for having supported the Mubarak regime and provided the military with a third of its budget, but on an individual level, they're charming and delighted to have us there. I think they understand that the media translates into pressure on the government. Outside, some nasty scenes. One of the BBC journalists was in Giza yesterday, and the people surrounded their car and took them to the police, and then the police couldn't really hold back the mob who wanted to beat them up, so they had to call in the army and be rescued, and the army, to give them the credit, did come and get them out. But that was, I think, once again, people who felt that they were foreign agents destabilizing Egypt. It wasn't a very sophisticated understanding of America's media,
and
or
Mona,
Britain's
I know,
media in that case.
Yeah, Mona, you've said that Mubarak has used state-run media to disseminate myths and propaganda to dissuade the protesters and maybe fuel the anger against journalists that Liz was just describing.
Absolutely. This is a game that the Mubarak regime has long played. The Mubarak regime is one of the United States' best friends in the region, and it gets $1.5 billion every year in aid. And yet at the same time, it's very skillfully used state-run media to foment this anti-US feeling. And you see it, I mean, it's kind of reached its apex over the past 2 weeks, where basically state-run television has been telling people, Egyptians who are not at Tahrir Square and who are not aware of the large numbers who have been rising up against the Mubarak regime. The state propaganda line is, these are agents of Israel and the United States sent in from abroad, and they've even brought in people who claim to have been in Tahrir Square and who have now seen the light. Kind of, you know, we were brainwashed into rising up against our beloved Egypt. We were given money by, they mentioned Freedom House, a DC-based human rights organization, and they say we were given money by Freedom House to basically come back to Egypt and rise up against our beloved country. So it's just awful propaganda that I think the US administration is not aware of, or if it is aware, then, you know, they're really missing the boat on this, because they seem to be backtracking on their line vis-a-vis what's happening in Egypt and not
in terms of the pressure to get Mubarak to leave.
Absolutely.
Now, they really started to pull back over the weekend, didn't they?
They have, especially after Frank Wisner went to Cairo and met with Mubarak, and now it's been revealed in the independent newspaper and other media that Wisner is employed by a firm that used to be employed by the Mubarak regime. So you're kind of stepping into this territory now of conflict of interest, and, you know, whose side is everybody on? Because we were hearing, you know, a peaceful transition of power now, and then this weekend Secretary Clinton said we want an orderly transition, and they seem to be taking the side of the Vice President Omar Suleiman, who is feared and not liked at all in Egypt. And he himself now has come out and said Egyptians don't understand the culture of democracy, despite the fact that millions of Egyptians are out on the streets wanting democracy. But more ominously, he and other state officials, including the foreign minister today, has warned that these adventurers, quote unquote, which is what he describes these pro-democracy demonstrators, if they don't stop what they're doing, the armed forces will step in more forcefully to basically secure national interest.
Is the propaganda working on, you know, I asked Stephen about, is there a segment of the population supportive of Mubarak? You have family and friends there. I mean, does he enjoy any support other than, say, the military that obviously is benefiting from this regime?
Not the people I know, but I'll tell you of a personal incident that shows you just what the propaganda was doing. My sister-in-law's brother and cousin have been in Tahrir Square and were trapped in the National Museum during that awful day when the thugs came in. Now, just the days running up to that, her father was watching state-run television in Egypt and was calling her in a panic all the way here in the US to tell her, you must persuade your brother not to go to Tahrir Square because there will be a massacre and he will die. And so state-run television was basically instilling the fear of God in people about what was going on outside. And now obviously that you know, we've ridden this awful tide in Egypt and people realize what was going on, more and more people are turning against state-run propaganda. And one of the a famous television anchor on Nile television, she left her position and she said, I can't do this anymore. I can't feed the Egyptian people lies. And now, I mean, just to show you how comical it's all become, someone on Twitter just tweeted that, and I think this is a joke, I don't think it's serious, that Egyptian state-run television is now saying that demonstrators are standing in Tahrir Square holding these black boxes made in the US without keyboards with an apple on the back. So they're suggesting that iPads and iPhones are being used as these kind of ominous American instruments of revolution, kind of like iRevolution in Egypt. That's the joke that's going around Cairo now.
Stephen, let me ask you, though, you know, Mona brought up the point that the U.S. policy seemed to shift over the weekend. But to play devil's advocate for a moment, and Mona, feel free to chime in after Stephen, but isn't there some valid concern about a transition of power that occurs too rapidly? I mean, is there any wisdom in saying, hold on, everyone, you know, we need to get our ducks in a row and we need to sort of organize elections, and we don't want to necessarily have a power vacuum that will leave Egypt in worse shape than it was under Mubarak?
Well, certainly there is this notion that you need to, as you said, get your ducks in a row, organize a new political order. The problem with waiting this time period of 6, 7, 8 months, perhaps even longer, is that it provides an opportunity for Omar Suleiman, who, let me remind you, is the former director of the General Intelligence Service, which both has a foreign and domestic intelligence function, and he's been responsible for domestic issues as well. It gives him and the people around him, as well as President Mubarak, an opportunity to manipulate the political process to their advantage. And you already see these kinds of things happening in their efforts at negotiation with the opposition as a way to split the opposition and sow uncertainty between them. So whereas in one sense, in the halls of the State Department, it does seem like a good idea to slow things down a bit, that perhaps if things go too quickly, we'll end up in a situation of chaos. At the same time, if the United States is truly interested in a favorable democratic outcome, they should be concerned about the next 6 or 7 months and the opportunity this provides the defenders of the regime to undermine a genuine political opening and a genuine demand for democracy among millions of Egyptians.
You think the window might be closed if they don't act quickly enough? And, you know, you mentioned Omar Suleiman and Mubarak. We got a question on Twitter, which is, what is the difference between the two men? Or are they both two faces of the same coin? I mean, are they pretty much cut from the same cloth?
Well, it's important to recognize that Omar Suleiman has been the right-hand man of President Mubarak for the better part of the last 15 years. He controls some of the most important files in Egyptian foreign policy. And as I said, the General Intelligence Service, which he has led, also has a domestic intelligence function. He's not known to be a progressive by any stretch of the imagination. So what we are talking about here is essentially the same side of the coin. It is important to recognize that although the demonstrations have gained momentum in the last couple of days after that extraordinary moment with Wael Ghonim on television the other night, the Google executive, each day that this goes on, as Mona pointed out, state-run television, the propaganda machine really kicks into high gear. More and more people, they're trying to peel people away from the square. They're trying to peel people away. They're trying to reinstill the fear that melted away in the first 2 weeks of this. And the longer this goes on, the chances of those things working, and it provides the regime an opportunity to manipulate the political process.
And Liz, you know, you've been covering the opposition. I know you covered one of the early meetings of opposition leaders. Are they unified at this point in time? You know, we hear about all these different groups and all these different opposition leaders. The Muslim Brotherhood, they were able to, they participated in negotiations and then they walked out, right? And so what is going on with the opposition? Do they have a common goal?
Not yet. I think, broadly speaking, their objectives are the same. They want the state of emergency lifted. They want to know that free and fair elections are coming up. They want Mubarak out. But they were beginning to talk and to try and find some common ground, and then they realized that Omar Suleiman was having talks with sort of tame opposition leaders, really. They felt as if they were left out of the process, and I think it made them angry, and they've sort of defaulted back to this granular opposition and the one bottom line: we want Mubarak out. It's unfortunate because the hard political work that should be going on now is not, as far as I can tell, going on in a way that will make them ready to step up if it looks as if the Egyptian government is ready to step up and really talk Turkey.
And Mona, do you think there will be chaos, as Mubarak has claimed, if he leaves now immediately, as the protesters have repeatedly demanded?
Right. You know, it's really interesting to hear the Mubarak regime say that there will be chaos in our wake when they are instrumental in creating that very same chaos they keep warning about. Because not only did we see this day where they sent in thugs on horses and on camelback, but, as Stephen mentioned, it's very important to understand why they want to dig their heels in and why they're buying time. time, because with every day that passes, human rights activists and bloggers and activists generally are being arrested and detained and disappearing. I mean, every day I get new lists of people of the disappeared, the detained and the martyred. So, and just yesterday we heard of news breaking out of in the new valley, Wadi Gidid, an oasis in southern Egypt, where the police there were unleashing their brutality against unarmed demonstrators, and where state-run television obviously was not covering it, and at least 3 people were killed, 100 were injured, and there's a very important museum down there, and according to the reports I was getting from people who have friends and family there, police set on fire a gas station and were beating people and shooting, using live ammunition. So the point I'm making is that the Mubarak regime continues to instill and unleash chaos every day, and to beat, arrest and detain people every day. And so imagine what it would end up doing if we left it in place until September. So I don't trust them for a bit. No one in Egypt I know trusts them for a bit. And I think what they're also skillfully doing is that they're using this kind of smokescreen or fig leaf of the constitution and the law in Egypt to try to buy time, when, you know, my question to the US administration is, this is a regime that has been in power for 30 years and never cared about free and fair elections or the constitution. Why all of a sudden now are we being concerned with the constitution? It's a lie, it's a smokescreen, and I urge the US administration to get back onto its, you know, insistence that we see a smooth transition of power now, not wait for.
In fact, Stephen, if in fact, Stephen, you know, the Mubarak regime is using this period to kind of regenerate or kind of get its act together again, what should the U.S. government do? What role should it be playing? Because I can only imagine this is creating even more animosity among the Egyptian people for the United States, because they almost look like they've aligned themselves in this particular situation with Mubarak.
I think it's a terrific point, and I think that it's important for the Obama administration to recognize that we have very little leverage either with the regime or the people in the streets demanding democracy. Egyptians are now writing their own history. We do give them $1.5 billion in aid, but that doesn't buy us a lot of leverage. I think at this point, the United States needs to step back and focus on first principles, on democracy, on human rights, and freedom. This is a regime, people are continually worried about chaos and the problem of violence. This is a regime that established control of the population through the threat of violence or the actual application of violence. Clearly, the Egyptian people are speaking that they no longer want to be subject to this brutality. And as a result, the United States really should, at some point, principle has to come in here. As it turns out, no matter how this situation shakes itself out, Washington's interests in Egypt have changed dramatically. It's not going to be an easy time should the regime hang on. It's likely not to be an easy time should there be some democratic opening in Egypt, given our long history of enabling a non-democratic regime, one that brutalizes its own people. So at least now, the best that we can do is step back and focus on those first principles of human rights, democracy, freedom, transfer of power, a meaningful transfer of power, and the writing of a new constitution.
Mona is nodding her head. I wanted to ask you, do you think that a new government in Egypt, of course, some of the concern is it's going to be very adversarial to Israel, and that's one of the reasons the U.S. has been such a strong ally of Egypt's, because of the peace they have forged with Israel, and then other theories that it's going to become an Islamist theocracy like Iran. When you look at Egypt and you see what's going on there and unfolding, can you imagine either of those scenarios coming to pass? Right.
Before I even answer that, I want to make it very clear that this revolution has been about Egypt and nothing but Egypt. So, you know, all this kind of alarmism about what's going to happen with Israel, quite honestly, Egyptians don't care. They're not thinking about Israel right now, because what they're thinking about is how to get rid of this regime that has been strangling their country, suffocating their country for 30 years. Having said that, I cannot imagine that millions of Egyptians have been on the street now, standing up to Mubarak's thugs, and then the first thing on their list of priorities, once they get rid of the regime, is to go to war with Israel. That is just a scenario that I cannot imagine, because what I think on our list of priorities as Egyptians is, writing up a new constitution, free and fair elections, human rights, freeing political dissidents from jails, education, poverty, job creation, so many things that we need to do as Egyptians that the Mubarak regime has neglected to do.
You're looking inside, not outside.
Yeah, I'm going to look outside now because we have this peace treaty with Israel, and I don't think the peace treaty will be affected. I think even if you speak to the Muslim Brotherhood today, they will tell you that our priority is Egypt and they're not thinking about the outside. So I think that the peace treaty will remain. That will not change, but I'll tell you what else won't change. Hatred of Egyptians for Israel, because we have to be honest. Egyptians do deeply dislike Israel because of its occupation of Palestinians and because of the siege on Gaza. And Egyptians directly associate the Mubarak regime with that because the Mubarak regime has enabled the siege of Gaza. So what we've also been seeing is the Mubarak regime presents itself as Israel's friend, while at the same time basically distracting Egyptians with and creating this greater hatred for Israel, the same that I said in the same way that it did with state propaganda with the US. And what I tell Israeli friends and what I tell Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is Israelis boast that they are the only democracy in the Middle East. I'm now telling them, here is a country, your neighbor, who you have a peace treaty with, that also wants to be a democracy. Surely you should support that because democratic neighbors are happy neighbors.
What about the whole notion of it turning into another Iran, just really quickly? Is that kind of just alarmism as well?
Yeah, Egypt is not Iran. And the Muslim Brotherhood, though, is definitely a part of Egyptian society. The Muslim Brotherhood is there. They probably have 20% of the support of Egyptians. So I definitely think that they will be there as part of any future government. But I just don't think they're going to take over. This is a revolution that represents all political voices, not just the Islamists.
And Liz, I know you probably have to go and file a piece for tonight's evening news. But just in closing for you, Liz, I mean, you've been covering this day in and day out. And I want to say again what an exceptional job I think you've been doing over there under a lot of danger and very difficult circumstances. But if you had to predict, how do you see this thing shaking out? Do you see elections being moved? I mean, can this go on till September?
I think it could, but I suspect it won't. I think that this thing has a momentum that is going to lead to another confrontation, particularly if the Vice President, Omar Suleiman, makes good on his threats so far veiled to ask the army to intervene. So I think there's real potential that it could turn very ugly again. I wanted to go back to the point that the United States doesn't have a lot of leverage over what's going on here. That $1.3 billion that the Egyptian military got in aid from the United States last year was a third of Egypt's defense budget. That gives the United States a very high card to play in this. So I'm hoping that somehow back channel the people with the high cards are going to find a way out of this, because I think it could become a massacre.
And Stephen was I just don't want to good night you, Liz, until I get Stephen to respond to that, because he shook his head as you mentioned that amount of money, and I just want to give him an opportunity to tell you why he was doing that.
Thanks very much, Katie. And Liz, you're quite right that officially it's 1/3 of the budget, but recognize the fact that it's the same $1.3 billion that we gave in 1985, which means it's worth about 40% less. And of course, you have the large Egyptian conglomerate, this control of a business empire that contributes mightily to the Egyptian armed forces, which are off budget and not subject to public view. So the budget is quite bigger than what they officially talk about.
All right, Stephen Cook and Liz Palmer, I'm going to say thank you so much to both of you for talking with us. I'm going to ask Mona one last question. Liz, if you need to go, you go and do your work. And Stephen, if you'd like to listen to Mona's final answer. I just wanted to know, on a personal note, as an Egyptian, you moved here 10 years ago, is that right?
Yes.
Someone who has a huge network of friends in Egypt and family members as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, personally for you, watching this, I mean, it must be somewhat frustrating not to be able to participate in this movement that you're clearly so passionate about. But what does it mean to you as an Egyptian to watch what's going on in your country right now?
It's the most exciting time of my life. This is something that I and everyone I know has always dreamed of. And in 2005, you know, Stephen mentioned the uprising has a longer history than April 6th. He's absolutely right. At the end of 2004, when the Kafaya movement started with protests against the Mubarak regime, 2005 was considered kind of the flowering of that movement. And I was very lucky to be back in Egypt, and I took part in many of those protest marches, and many of those young people I marched through the streets of Cairo with are now spending night after night in Tahrir Square, and I'm so proud of them. And you know, I always tell them, you know, my heart is burning that I'm not there with you, but I'm happy that I'm here because I'm staging what I call my media uprising. Because as an Egyptian, I want to get out how excited I am to the US media. I'm very happy to be speaking with you here, and I speak to as many media as I can because I think it's very important that people understand what a huge turning point this is to the history of Egypt and how it means so much for every Arab I know, because once we make it work in Egypt, and I'm convinced the revolution will succeed, this will be an amazing opening for the entire region. I'm so proud of every Egyptian on the streets of Egypt today. Well,
Mona Eltahawy. Mona, thank you. And Stephen, thanks again for your insight.
Thank you.
It was really, really valuable, and I appreciate it so much. What did you say? The internet doesn't invent courage? Is that what you're create courage? Is that what you said?
It hasn't invented courage, but it's just it helps spread courage all around.
Well, thank you both so much, and again, thanks to Liz Palmer who had to head off, and thanks to all of you for watching and for sending us your questions on Facebook or Twitter. Stay with CBS News. We'll have all the latest from Egypt, and remember, you can see all the episodes of this web show anytime. Just go to cbsnews.com. We'll see you later.